Hello everyone, today we come to the next horror stories. Let's start. This is a true story recorded by the author. Author, Peter Park. Narrator, Radio Mystery. The gentle rays of the morning sun poured down, signaling the start of a new day. Deep in a narrow alley, amidst the dusty city, people greeted each other cheerfully as they headed to work. The sounds of street vendors and the crackling music coming from a speaker at the alley's entrance created a lively atmosphere that was characteristic of city life. At the end of the alley stood a small, dilapidated house. Inside, the steady sound of snoring echoed from the man lying on the bed. A few minutes later, the alarm clock chimed. David turned over, reached for his old brick phone, and turned it off. Yawning repeatedly, he sat up. David was in his 40s, but just by looking at his exterior, one might guess he was in his 50s due to his aged appearance. Additionally, the scar on his left cheek gave him a somewhat rugged demeanor. Notably, David had just completed a prison sentence a short while ago. David lived alone, without a wife or children, and had been a driver for many years. In the past, he had lived carelessly and recklessly, which eventually led to a tragic accident while he was drunk. David received a few years in prison. At his age, losing his freedom was perhaps the price he had to pay for his mistakes. As time passed behind bars, he now realized the value of freedom and was determined to turn his life around. On the day David was released back into society, no one came to pick him up. It was understandable, as he had no one left. David stepped out of the prison gates with an old backpack slung over his shoulder, carrying a mix of happy and sad memories. The blazing summer sun made him squint, but it could not hide the faint smile on his lips. Life outside seemed to have changed so much. In an instant, everything felt unfamiliar to him. David walked down the road home, hoping to find a little peace. After being released, David returned to a normal life, wishing to find a decent job to start over. In the beginning, he faced numerous difficulties in finding work. At this age, he continually faced rejection. When social media cast suspicious glances at David, those who knew him shook their heads in disappointment as they recalled the brash and arrogant past of a driver like him. Sometimes, they did not shy away from expressing their contempt, leaving David feeling a bit disheartened. However, the months spent behind bars had transformed David into a quieter person, and he gradually became accustomed to the insults. Every morning, he would wake up early and walk through the streets seeking employment. His weary feet treaded on the dusty sidewalks, and his gaze often lingered on the job advertisement billboards, his heart heavy. In the evening, David would return to his small house, the only possession he had at the moment. Lying on the old bed, he listened to the rain falling outside the window and pondered his future. David did not dare to dream of anything distant, he only hoped for a stable job. Yet, the meager meal of instant noodles had become a familiar routine. He saved every scant coin he had left, trying to set aside enough to sustain his life. Each time he looked in the mirror, David saw only a dejected man, with weary eyes filled with despair. Perhaps the images from prison still haunted him. Today, like any other day, David woke up and walked out to the porch, pulled out a cigarette, lit it up, and took a puff. He planned to think about where to look for a job when the phone rang. On the other end was the hoarse voice of another man. "Are you awake?" David took another drag from his cigarette before replying. "Yeah, I'm awake." "Good, I'm on my way over." David hung up the phone, his gaze lost in thought as he looked out onto the street. The person who had just called was Thomas, his old man, the only one who had helped him when he got out of prison. Thomas lent David some money to get by while he waited for work. Previously, Thomas had suffered business losses and asked David to lend him some money to start over. After thinking it over, David didn't hesitate to lend him the money. Even though Thomas had fully repaid him later and had even given him a little extra, David never forgot that he had once helped Thomas. Now, Thomas was helping him back without any hesitation. 10 minutes later, Thomas rode in on a red air blade, smiling as he entered the yard. "Have you had breakfast yet?" David took one last drag from that cigarette and flicked it away, shaking his head. "Then get in the car, I'll take you." David didn't refuse. He went inside the house to grab a short jacket and then climbed into Thomas's car. He only partially closed the door, since there was nothing of value inside to worry about. Thomas drove David to the noodle shop at the end of the alley, ordering a full bowl of noodles. After they finished eating, they swung by the coffee shop next door to have a conversation. Thomas asked, "Have you found a job yet?" David shook his head. "Not yet, it's really tough to find work now. I don't have the means to travel far, and around here, they only hire young people. Plus, looking at me, I seem intimidating, so they never hire me." Thomas chuckled. "Is that so? Have you thought carefully about my proposal?" David fell into deep thought, remaining silent. Thomas's family ran a small business, and as it gradually became more successful, they wanted to expand. However, they faced a problem. They needed someone to drive goods over long distances, but they couldn't find a driver. Knowing that David was an experienced driver, Thomas had suggested inviting him to join. The only issue was that David didn't want to return to his old profession. Perhaps the years had left him with a haunting sense of belonging to that life. Seeing his friend not responding, Thomas sighed and took a sip of coffee before speaking up. "I know you don't want to take the wheel anymore. But think about it, if you want to start over, any job is a job as long as it's not illegal. Besides, whatever you're good at, do that. It would be a waste to let your years of driving experience go to waste. And how long do you plan to keep this up? Work with me, I'll pay you monthly, you can save a little, and you might need it when you grow older." That day, the driver had managed to bring it up several times, but David kept refusing. However, after understanding his current difficulties, David began to hesitate. Thomas continued, "If you agree, we can start next month. The specifics of the job, I'll explain when you come work with me. What do you think?" It took a long time for David to think it through before he finally nodded. "All right, that sounds good. I'll follow you." Thomas laughed heartily, thumping his thigh. "Great, we'll figure out the work later. Come over this afternoon and let's have a little drink." Seeing his friend not responding, Thomas sighed and took a sip of coffee before speaking up. "I know you don't want to get behind the wheel anymore. But think about it, if you want to start over, what job doesn't have its merits? As long as it's not illegal, it's fine. Besides, whatever you're good at, do that. It'd be a waste to not use your years of driving experience. And how long do you plan to continue like this? Work with me, I'll pay you monthly, you can save up a bit for later on when you're older." That day, the man had tried to convince David several times, but David had always refused. However, after understanding the difficulties David was currently facing, he seemed somewhat hesitant. Thomas continued, "If you agree, we can start next month. I'll explain the specific job details when you come to work with me. What do you say?" After a long moment of thought, David came to terms with it and nodded. "All right, I can do that. I'll follow you." Thomas laughed heartily, slapping his thigh. "Great, we'll sort out the work later. Come by this afternoon for a drink to celebrate. Let's just consider it a congratulation for your new job." "Thank you, I'm lucky to have your help." "No need to thank me, we've known each other for a long time. No need for courtesy. I know you're not a bad person. I'll help you in any way I can. I've made up my mind." Before long, 2 weeks passed. David arrived at Thomas's place to start his new job, feeling a bit nervous. Today was David's first day at work. Prior to this, Thomas had briefly explained the job to David, which simply entailed coming here to pick up goods and waiting for the delivery point. There would be a loading crew, so David didn't have to do much. In the beginning, David felt somewhat reluctant to sit behind the wheel. However, gradually, he became more comfortable. Initially, he was mentally burdened and only accepted short trips. Later, Thomas convinced David to take on longer routes due to the increasing amount of goods, including some nighttime trips. At first, David felt somewhat reluctant to sit behind the wheel, but over time, he also became more at ease. No longer feeling burdened psychologically, David initially only accepted short trips. Later, Thomas convinced David to take longer routes as the volume of goods increased and he had to drive overnight. 6 months passed, and everything continued to be stable like that. David had also become more open and integrated into the surrounding life. Until one day, Thomas called David over with a bright smile. "Hey, David, do you know what I just bought?" David lit a cigarette, shook his head to show he didn't know. Thomas chuckled and led David to the workshop behind, pointing at the truck and saying, "What do you think?" David frowned, not understanding Thomas's intention, but still carefully examined the vehicle. After a while of inspecting, David replied, "Well, it's not a new truck, but it hasn't been driven much. Everything is still in good condition." "Right, nothing less from an experienced driver. I just bought this truck. Perhaps the owner needed money or something, so he sold it for cheap. I had to act fast to seal the deal, otherwise, someone else would have bought it." David, upon hearing this, was not surprised. The scene of a man selling a good car for cheap is not uncommon. David himself once sold his car for just a third of its value due to gambling. Thomas continued. "From tomorrow, you will drive this one. Conveniently test it and see how it is. I noticed you are often driving at night lately. I prioritize a good car for you, just work hard." David nodded and thanked Thomas. He had become accustomed to David's few words since his release from prison. He hurriedly waved his hand and pulled his close friend into the kitchen to warm up some tea and chat casually. That day, David was still driving his old car because Thomas needed to inspect the newly purchased truck thoroughly to ensure there were no issues before handing it over to David the following day. That night, while the whole family was deep in sleep, Thomas suddenly jolted awake from a bone-chilling cold creeping through the sheets, seeping into his very bones. He opened his eyes, groping around for a moment, feeling that the room seemed darker than usual. Although he knew it was still late at night, just as he thought he might have been overthinking, he suddenly heard a soft murmuring rising in the night. Accompanied by the sound of wind whistling through the door cracks, the murmuring echoed, sometimes fading away, sometimes close, without a clear source. Suddenly, Thomas felt uneasy. His heart raced, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. He sat up quietly, trying not to wake his wife and children, straining to listen. However, while he was focusing on the strange sounds, Thomas unexpectedly noticed a shadow moving right outside the glass of his bedroom window, weaving back and forth. The shadow had no distinct shape, just blurry streaks, but it made Thomas anxious. He was thinking about the possibility of a thief visiting his home. Suddenly, there was a clatter of something breaking outside, along with louder, more frantic sounds, like footsteps running back and forth on the wooden floor. This time, Thomas was certain there was a burglar. "Hey, wake up!" Thomas gently shook his wife awake, but she did not respond at all, lying still. Even their 7-year-old son, nestled between them, remained the same. Their sleep seemed undisturbed by the strange noises. Accompanying this was the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks of the door, the distant murmurs that fluctuated between close and far, echoing here, there, and everywhere without a clear source. Suddenly, Thomas felt uneasy. His heart raced, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. He sat up gently, trying not to wake his wife and child, and strained to listen. However, as he was straining to catch the strange sounds, Thomas unexpectedly saw a dark shadow moving just outside the glass of his bedroom window, weaving back and forth. The shadow lacked a clear shape, it was merely a blurred outline, yet it filled Thomas with anxiety. He was entertaining the thought that there might be a burglar in his house. Suddenly, there was the sound of something crashing outside, followed by those strange noises that became louder and more frantic, like footsteps running back and forth on the wooden floor. This time, Thomas was convinced there was a burglar in the house. "Hey, wake up!" Thomas gently shook his wife, but she showed no response, lying still and motionless. Even their 7-year-old son, who lay between them, was similarly unfazed. Their sleep seemed completely unaffected by the unusual sounds. Although he felt confused, Thomas had no time to think much. He got out of bed and tried to turn on the light, hoping the illumination from the room would scare away the thieves. He was genuinely afraid they would carry out a killing spree to eliminate witnesses. So, the sooner they were gone, the better. As for his belongings, they could be replaced at another time. He thought that way, but no matter how he tried, the light wouldn't turn on. He could only rely on the faint glow from the streetlight outside to feel his way around. Suddenly, a chilling, giggling laugh rang out right beside him. Thomas started and turned his gaze, but saw nothing but darkness. The laughter seemed to come from deep within his mind, making him feel as if he were losing his sanity. His heart raced faster and faster. He felt as if someone was standing in the dark corner watching him, yet he couldn't see anything. Thomas turned back and tried to call out his wife and child's names, but his voice got stuck in his throat, and he could only feel his own breath and those strange sounds clearer than ever. He took a deep breath to steady himself, gathering all his courage to approach the bedroom door. With each step, he felt as if he were sinking into the cold wooden floor. He cracked the door open slightly, trying to observe outside, but everything remained unchanged except for the strange atmosphere he sensed. Strange noises from the living room echoed again, resembling the sound of an animal that had fallen. Thomas didn't think much, quickly grabbing a broom and rushing down the stairs. Upon reaching the living room, he saw everything in disarray, with furniture strewn across the floor. In the middle of the living room, a large mirror lay shattered, reflecting hazy images that resembled distorted faces trapped within the glass. Before Thomas could recover from his shock, every sound seemed to engulf him in a chilling embrace. Behind him, a window stood wide open. The wind blew through, causing the window to gently bang against the walls, while the white curtains in his house billowed up and down. Then he felt his heart skip a beat when he saw the white curtain lifted by the wind, not falling back down as it usually would, but rather, surprisingly, floating in mid-air. Thomas rubbed his eyes to see clearly. The more it happened, the more terrified Thomas became, for the white curtain now seemed to cover a person standing there. However, it was strange that every time the wind blew and the curtain fluttered, there was no one there. So why did it look like it was draping over an invisible person each time it fell? But just as Thomas blinked, everything vanished as if nothing had happened. The curtain continued to dance in the wind as usual. Thomas tried to calm himself, telling himself it was just an illusion. But at that moment, a cold, mournful sigh echoed from behind him. Thomas spun around, but saw nothing. A wave of horror surged within him as he rushed up the stairs. Yet, at that moment, each of his steps seemed to be pulled back by invisible hands. With every time he lifted his foot to step forward, the wooden floor creaked under him, like the sound of frost breaking. When he reached the bedroom, the door suddenly slammed shut in front of him, the noise so loud it made his heart skip a beat for a moment. He banged on the door and called for his wife. But there was no response. For a moment, he heard a wild laughter echoing from within, mingling with the screams. Despite his fear, Thomas mustered all his strength and kicked the door open. When the door swung wide, Thomas found only an empty room, furniture scattered everywhere. On the floor, deep scratches marked like the claws of some creature. The light from outside streamed through the window, illuminating a long trail of blood leading from the center of the room to the dark corner. Thomas stepped closer, his heart racing uncontrollably. In the dark corner, he saw a figure curled up. As he approached, the figure seemed to merge into the darkness, disappearing from view. If it weren't for the trail of blood, he would have thought he was seeing things. Thomas trembled, hurriedly searching for his wife and children, but found no one. He wanted to call out, but his throat tightened, leaving him unable to voice a sound. He bent down to check beneath the bed, but there was nothing. In his panic, he looked up to see a dark silhouette standing right at the doorway. The red eyes stared intently at him. Before he could react, the dark shadow lunged at him, enveloping him in an icy chill, pulling him into the endless darkness of the hallway. In that darkness, Thomas heard laughter echoing from all directions, the laughter gradually growing clearer, as if many voices were merging together. Each sound carried the weight of pain and resentment. He felt icy hands touching him, sending shivers down his spine. His heart raced wildly, his breath came in quick gasps. Thomas struggled to break free, but the more he fought, the tighter the unseen hands gripped him. He felt himself falling into an endless dark space, with no way out. Terrifying images, distorted faces, and frantic laughter surrounded him relentlessly. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas. Thomas jolted awake. Beside him were his wife and children, looking at him with expressions of surprise. What were you dreaming that had you screaming like that? It's morning, open your eyes already and stop sleeping. Get up, I'm going to the fields now, I still have to eat and go to work, Taylor said as she pulled her son downstairs, ignoring Thomas who was still sitting there, with a dazed look and his body drenched in sweat. Thomas looked worn out and it turned out it was just a dream. He picked up his phone to check the time. However, the sound nearby made Thomas look to the side and see the window that Taylor had opened to let the morning sunlight into the room. The wind was blowing against the window, gently tapping against the wall, making him unexpectedly think of the nightmare from the day before. Thomas suddenly shuddered. He noticed that the curtain was still swaying gently before the window. That sound was still echoing steadily, filling the walls, repeating the noise just like the horrifying dream he had experienced. The cold feeling from the nightmare still lingered, causing him to shiver once more. Thomas reassured himself that it was all just a dream, but the unease clung tightly to his mind. He slowly sat up, trying to dispel the lingering fears. The distorted images, the eerie laughter, and the terrifying shadow from the nightmare seemed to still be lurking somewhere. In the bedroom, Thomas tried to reassure himself, thinking it was just a reaction of a mind haunted by the worries of work and life. When he stood up and stepped closer to the window, he suddenly froze. A faint smudge of a handprint was imprinted on the glass, as if someone had just touched it from the outside. He quickly glanced around the room, but there was nothing unusual. The swing was still swaying, and there were no other signs of anything amiss. His heart raced as he struggled to remain composed, convincing himself it was probably an old mark he hadn't noticed before. But the heavy feeling continued to weigh down on him, making it hard for him to breathe. Unable to stand still any longer, he hurried out of the room and went down to the kitchen where his wife and children were preparing breakfast. Taylor looked at her husband with a worried expression when she saw Thomas's pale face, sweat pouring down his forehead. "What's wrong with you? It's early in the morning and you look so down, like you've lost your mind." Thomas hesitated for a moment, then shook his head, trying to put on a weak smile as he replied to his wife, "Oh, it's nothing. Last night I just dreamed of a nightmare. I was lost in random thoughts, probably because I have been working too much and feeling a bit stressed." Taylor didn't ask anything further, just shook his head and continued tidying up the dining table. Thomas sat down, trying to collect himself to have breakfast, but he couldn't stop thinking about that dream. It felt so real that it made him angry. The clanging sound still echoed from somewhere in the house. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and began to eat breakfast, attempting to forget about the strange dream. After eating, Thomas focused on his work. Throughout that day, his mind remained preoccupied with the horrific dream. Was it merely a nightmare, or was it a sign of something terrifying about to happen? That evening, David came over to drive the truck as usual. Normally, he would arrive later since he primarily had to drive around. But today, Thomas had entrusted David with the new truck, so he came early to test it out and get familiar with it for the long drive ahead. At first, David saw Thomas with a dazed expression, continuously smoking at the drinking table. David asked, "Did you do something yesterday that left you looking so worn out today?" As he spoke, David glanced over at Taylor, who was taking notes. Taylor, having overheard, chimed in, "What do you expect? He was tossing and turning all night, and now he looks like a ghost." When I asked him, he just shook his head and wouldn't say a word. Upon hearing this, David frowned. "Is that so? What did you dream about?" Thomas responded, "Just random stuff, it's nothing." Then Thomas handed the car keys to David. "Here's the car, take it for a spin to get used to it. If there are any issues, let me know. If necessary, I'll take it in for maintenance." David took the keys and asked his friend, "Are you sure you're okay? You look really tired. Maybe you should take a day or two off, don't push yourself." Thomas smiled and nodded, "Yeah, I'm fine, I guess it's just the lack of booze causing this." David chuckled, chatted a bit more, and then headed out to the car. Looking at the pickup truck that seemed relatively new, at least newer than the one he had been driving for a while, David felt a bit of anticipation. The truck was parked at the end of the alley, its silver body gleaming under the dim streetlights. David opened the door and stepped into the cab. The engine roared to life as he turned the key. Being an experienced driver, he knew just by the sound of the engine that this was a good vehicle. David eased off the accelerator, and the truck started rolling down the lit road. He took the vehicle for a few laps around the block. As he was driving, David felt a chill, even though he hadn't turned on the air conditioning. However, he didn't pay much attention to it and brushed it off. After driving a few rounds, he returned to Thomas's house. Seeing his friend come back, Thomas asked, "How was it? Will it be all right?" David sat down across from him, pulled out a cigarette, took a drag, then replied, "The truck is good, you got this one at a bargain, so that's fine. The machinery seems all right." Thomas chuckled. "Good things come to those who are kind." The two chatted for a while, then it was time to depart. David said goodbye to Thomas and got back in the truck to start his nighttime journey. After completing the usual paperwork, the truck began rolling on. Everything proceeded as it typically did. Throughout the journey, David hummed along to the tune from the radio in the new truck. It was also because of the new truck that he, despite being a skilled driver, sped a bit since it was still empty of cargo. In fact, he arrived at the loading site more than 30 minutes earlier than his usual schedule, just enough time for him to sip a cup of strong tea while enjoying a few puffs of his cigarette. After checking the inventory and loading the truck completely, David started his journey back. He drove slowly along the deserted road. The headlights cast long beams onto the dark shadows of the trees flanking the road. The engine hummed steadily. Amidst the tranquility of the night, David adjusted the frequency of the radio while driving. But for some reason, at this hour, it was no longer functioning, leaving him disappointed. Haze, could it be that it's broken already after just a short use? As the truck approached a deserted stretch of road, suddenly in the distance, he saw a faint white figure standing in the middle of the road, startling him and causing him to slam on the brakes. The truck came to a stop just a few meters away from the figure, enough for him to clearly see what was ahead. His heart pounded thunderingly, cold sweat beading on his forehead. It was a woman, with long hair cascading down, obscuring most of her face, wearing a light yellow shirt, but it was clear that it was stained with blood. The girl stood still, unmoving, as if she were a stone statue. David rubbed his eyes to see better, but only for a brief moment. That figure of the girl had vanished, as if she had never existed. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, reminding himself that this was just an illusion. But deep down, he knew that something unusual was happening. The car came to a stop in the midst of the misty road, the headlights shining straight into the silent night. David struggled to suppress the tension within, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Even though he could no longer see the outline of that woman, he still couldn't shake off the heavy feeling weighing on his mind. The crackling sound from the old radio broke the tense atmosphere. Suddenly, the radio became clearer. That creature adjusted the frequency just right, but instead of music, a shrill voice erupted from the speaker. The voice from the radio did not belong to this world. "Child, oh child." The phrase repeated, each utterance sharper and colder than the last. David was a hardened man, and his time spent in prison had made him someone who feared very little. Yet now, he found himself frozen, his limbs trembling, unable to turn off the radio. Suddenly, that voice morphed into laughter, a wild, haunting laughter that echoed back and forth in the stillness of the night. Each sound pierced his ears like needles, sending shivers down his spine and tightening his chest. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt constricted, rendering him mute. Gathering all his courage, he turned off the radio. The terrifying laughter vanished immediately, returning the space to a silence so profound that he could hear the frantic thumping of his own heart. Yet the heavy feeling did not diminish, in fact, it grew more pronounced. The shadows seemed to tighten around him. David turned to glance in the rearview mirror but saw nothing but empty space. However, something peculiar occurred, his breath began to chill, as if a fog was forming on the glass, creating a misty white layer. However, a strange thing happened. Mr. David's breath began to feel colder, like a layer of mist forming on the glass. In that moment, he realized something terrifying, that breath did not belong to him. The glass slowly became covered with a shape of a face, a pale face with haunting eyes. Its mouth wide open, as if screaming. Mr. David turned abruptly, but there was no one there, only an eerie chill lingering in the air. He trembled as he glanced down at the back seat, and again, there was no one. But when he turned back, he saw that face still there, lurking in the glass. A corpse trapped between two worlds. Mr. David's hands shook as he tried to start the engine, the sound of the engine roared steadily, but strangely, a bizarre noise also emerged from all around the car. He felt like there were fingernails scraping against the glass, whispers buzzing like thousands of tiny voices arguing amongst themselves. Mr. David felt like he was surrounded by invisible souls, trapped in this confined space. Just as he turned to look outside, a horrifying image suddenly struck his eyes. The woman in the blood-stained clothes stood there, dazed, her face pressed closely against the glass, revealing one side of her face with distorted skin, smeared with blood. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, cracked lips oozing a dark liquid. Her long black hair still obscured much of her face, but he could sense her cold, hollow eyes piercing straight into him. The girl remained motionless, saying nothing, just staring intently at Mr. David. A faint scratching sound echoed, but this time it came from the glass on the right. He turned his head, and in an instant, both sides of the glass were covered with pale hands, pressing tightly against the surface, wanting to break through and enter the car. This time, Mr. David truly felt fear. He fumbled to turn the key to start the engine, but the car remained still. The sound of the engine roared then fell silent again. In his panic, a light shone from behind, like a ray of hope for him at that moment. When he looked up, the woman was nowhere to be seen. At the same time, a passenger car slowly approached. Perhaps seeing the truck standing still in the middle of the road, this car stopped, and the window rolled down as a young man poked his face out. "What's wrong with your car, dude? Why are you standing in the middle of the road like this?" Mr. David was overjoyed and quickly replied, "Oh, my car just suddenly stalled in the middle of the road, I don't know what happened." The young man sitting in the car thought for a moment, looked around, then decided to get out of the vehicle. Perhaps he was also a bit reckless, so he wasn't afraid of the late-night robbery scene. Mr. David took the opportunity to get out as well, moving towards the front to shine the car light on himself, as if that light could somehow calm everything down. The young man walked over, lit a cigarette, and let the smoke drift into the air, casually offering Mr. David one as well. Mr. David did not refuse, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. "Are you driving at night? It's tough if the car breaks down at this hour." Mr. David took a deep drag, possibly feeling calmer now. Thinking back to the scene from earlier made him shudder. He couldn't recount those details to this young man. But just replying out of courtesy, the young man climbed into the cabin, and the first thing he did was try to turn the key to start the engine. To his surprise, the vehicle started up normally. It was as if nothing had happened. "Hey, am I lucky or what?" Mr. David exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, thank you, kid. What's brought you back here?" "Well, I was just heading into the city." "I suppose you're also delivering goods there, right? So let's go the same way, I'll ride with you a bit, in case something happens, it'd be tough." Mr. David nodded his gratitude profusely. At that moment, having someone along felt incredibly uplifting for him. Thus, a car and a truck continued to drive along the deserted road. After some time on the road, Mr. David lost track of everything for a moment as he glanced into the rearview mirror. Once again, he was startled to see a woman in bloody clothes standing in the middle of the road, silently watching his truck disappear into the distance. Mr. David swallowed hard, shifting his gaze forward, staying close behind the car, his mouth continuously mumbling prayers to calm himself down. As dawn approached, the two vehicles were nearing the city. On the road, there were sporadic people passing by. Mr. David bid farewell to the young driver and then turned in another direction, silently letting out a sigh of relief as he returned safely. He had never gone on a delivery trip that stirred so many different emotions before. At 7 in the morning, Mr. Thomas arranged to meet Mr. David at their usual faux restaurant for breakfast, then they headed to a coffee shop to sip leisurely. Upon seeing Mr. David looking rather weary, Mr. Thomas was surprised. "Hey, why do you look so tired today?" Mr. David yawned several times. "I'm usually used to staying up late and driving long distances, but it's just that I encountered something strange yesterday, so I feel so fatigued. I keep thinking about those horrifying images that I just can't explain." Using a cigarette, Mr. David took a puff. He decided not to rush into telling Mr. Thomas to avoid making him anxious. "It's nothing, just a few things happened yesterday. This morning I suddenly felt a stiff neck and my body feels tired." Seeing that his friend's demeanor was not quite right, Mr. Thomas said, "All right then, you've been driving non-stop for months now, so tonight just stay home and rest. When you're feeling better, you can get back to work. I'll cover for you tonight." Mr. David, upon hearing this, did not decline. "Yes, then I will take a day off, okay? Thank you, sir. No need for such formalities, just stop being so polite." The two laughed and chatted for a while before starting a light conversation. Around 9 a.m., Mr. David returned home to prepare for a daytime sleep, making up for the overnight trip. His house was deep in a small alley, so it was quite peaceful. Mr. David stepped into the bedroom, drew the sunlight blocking curtains, but the early morning light still filtered through the gaps in the window, dispelling the loneliness that had long lingered in the house. When Mr. David lay down on the bed, his weary body quickly melded into the softness of the bedspread, but his mind could not find any peace. Sleep did not come right away. Even though his eyes were heavy with fatigue, his thoughts kept spiraling around the haunting images of the woman from last night. "Who is she, I wonder?" Mr. David murmured, and then he drifted into sleep without realizing it, unsure of how long it had been. Suddenly, the room became abnormally cold. Mr. David vaguely felt a chilling air spreading, the invisible hands slowly enveloping his body. The icy sensation seemed to pierce through the layers of blankets, making him realize that something was tightening around his neck. The light from the bedside lamp in the room, which he never turned off, flickered unnaturally. Sounds began to emerge from the hidden corners of the room, strange noises, incomprehensible whispers causing the silence to gradually fade away. The heavy breathing, eerie moans, and softly but haunting footsteps made him feel as if something was moving around him. Each sound quickened Mr. David's heartbeat, filling him with confusion and fear. Mr. David wanted to open his eyes but could not. Nevertheless, he still sensed that the room seemed to be changing. The moaning sounds from the hidden corners continued to resonate, seemingly from another world altogether. From a place he could not reach, his breath was rapid, feeling as if invisible eyes were watching him, making the air in the room thick and oppressive. Suddenly, from deep within his mind, the haunting images of the night ride with the young girl began to emerge. He saw her desperate gaze, the silent cries echoing in his head. "My child." The image of the girl with wide, fearful eyes and a distorted face materialized in his mind. His entire body stiffened as if bound. In David's mind, the thought that he was being haunted had arisen, but the sounds of stifled cries and moans lingered close to his ear, as if an invisible force was holding him captive in this nightmare. He felt the presence of the girl right beside him. He struggled to turn but could not. In this half-asleep, half-awake state, David still could not escape from the nightmare. The room became a stream of horrors with strange noises and terrifying images continuously threatening, keeping him in a state of fear and despair, unable to break free. Suddenly, he heard the sound of a door opening beside him, followed by heavy, slow footsteps, as if someone was walking in and approaching him. Almost immediately, David's whole body was covered in goosebumps, and his spine went cold as a hand had just touched his body. It was gently sliding through his shirt, moving from his chest up towards his neck. David's breathing gradually became labored. By the time he realized he was being choked, his body began to react violently. He thrashed in desperation, and for a brief moment, David opened his eyes wide. A horrific, slimy, distorted face with disheveled hair was pressing closely against him, its gleaming white teeth twisted into a maniacal grin. Just as David began to weaken and his mind started to blur, he could still hear the voice of that woman ringing in his ears. "Where is my child? Give my baby back to me." After that last sound, David jolted upright, his entire body drenched in sweat, his eyes still lingering with the fear that had not yet dissipated. Outside, it had become pitch dark at some point. David kept thinking that. Why did that terrifying image continue to haunt him until now? Who was she that became entangled in this affair? Mr. David could not understand what had happened, nor if he had violated any taboo in the driving profession. He had some belief in the spiritual world to know that what he encountered was something beyond ordinary. Mr. David began to recall the entire day yesterday. It was still an ordinary day until the evening when he went to Mr. Thomas's house to test drive the new car. Right, drive the car. Realizing something, Mr. David sat gasping for breath on the bed, his whole body drenched in sweat, his heart filled with anxiety and fear. He tried to calm down. The horrific images of that woman still haunted his mind. He wanted to call Mr. Thomas to talk, but the clock showed it was past 2 or 3 a.m. Mr. Thomas was undoubtedly on the road, taking over his delivery for today. Yet, something compelled him to call his close friend immediately. Mr. David felt so uneasy. Something is waiting that is not right. Raising his phone, Mr. David trembled as he dialed Mr. Thomas's number. The long ringing echoed in the night, seeping into his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the call was connected. "Hello, is this Thomas?" "Yes, what's going on?" Mr. Thomas's voice came through the line, mixed with a hint of surprise. "Are you okay?" Mr. David tried to keep his voice calm, but the anxiety was unmistakable in each word. "Oh, I'm fine, what's the matter? Why are you calling me at this hour? Is something wrong?" Mr. David felt a bit relieved to hear Mr. Thomas's voice sounding normal, but his unease had not yet faded. No, nothing is wrong. I just wanted to check on you. Have you encountered anything strange on your way?" Mr. Thomas was even more perplexed. "Strange? No, everything is still normal. Why do you ask?" Mr. David hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to share the experiences he had gone through, but then decided to keep it to himself, at least until they met again. "I am very worried, but never mind. You remember to be careful. If there's anything, let me know right away." Despite feeling perplexed, Mr. Thomas responded to his friend's concern with a confident tone. "Oh, don't worry too much. I know. Let's meet tomorrow morning and talk. All right, you remember to be careful, okay?" Mr. David finished speaking and hung up, resolving his vague worries. He tried to reassure himself that Mr. Thomas would be fine, but a part of his heart could not shake off the anxiety. He sat quietly on the bed, his mind swirling with indistinct thoughts, feeling as if he had missed something important, yet he could not determine what it was. Meanwhile, on the deserted road, Mr. Thomas continued to drive forward. The headlights illuminated the empty road, and everything seemed normal. However, somewhere in the darkness, something was lurking, waiting, and Mr. Thomas's new car likely harbored secrets yet to be discovered. The path ahead of him appeared to be covered by a layer of black fabric. Mr. Thomas tried not to think about the phone call with Mr. David, although his friend's anxiety made him feel uneasy. The brand new truck that Mr. Thomas was driving tonight seemed to carry with it a strange atmosphere. The engine sound was steady, but something felt off, not the noise itself, but an underlying sensation in his gut, as if someone was watching, lurking from the darkness of the late night. Suddenly, the truck shook violently, as if it had just driven over something. Mr. Thomas jolted, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his face pressed against the road. The headlights illuminated nothing unusual, just an empty road, yet a chilling feeling began to creep into his body. Mr. Thomas reassured himself it was just a pothole, but just as that thought crossed his mind, the truck shook again, this time even harder. That eerie grip seemed to be tugging at the back of the truck. Mr. Thomas jerked the steering wheel, trying to keep the vehicle balanced. His heart began to race. The radio in the truck suddenly crackled to life, emitting strange, static sounds reminiscent of Mr. David's previous trip. Mr. Thomas glanced at the clock, it was almost midnight. The atmosphere in the car cabin became stuffy and suffocating. He intended to reach out and turn the knob to turn off the radio, when a heavy and distinct sigh echoed from the speakers, freezing him in place. His hand trembled as he tried to turn off the radio, but before he could do anything, the voice called out clearly more than ever. "I see a person sitting right behind you. Give my child back to me." Mr. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, slamming on the brakes abruptly. His whole body stiffened, his heart racing wildly in his chest. The voice came again, this time clearer and more insistent. "Give my child back to me." The voice echoed from behind the seat, accompanied by a chilling, persistent laughter. Mr. Thomas took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly and trying to stay calm, but the fear felt like an invisible hand tightening around his throat. Suddenly, the headlights in front of him began to flicker and dim. The road ahead plunged into darkness, leaving only a faint light. Inside the cabin, the lights were also flickering as if they were dying. The vehicle jolted once more, then slowly rolled forward as if it were driving itself. Mr. Thomas shivered when he saw a faint shadow in the rearview mirror, shaped like a woman sitting silently in the back seat. Her long, disheveled hair obscured half of her distorted face, along with her emaciated, curled-up body. Mr. Thomas was horrified. The car was still speeding through the night. He wanted to stop the car, but he couldn't. No matter how hard he pressed the brake, the figure behind him was moving, a chilling breath weaving through every strand of his hair. A voice whispered right next to his ear, accompanied by a chilling gust of air. Mr. Thomas, in his fear, struggled to turn his head, but as he did so, his eyes bore witness to a horrifying sight, a pair of white, soulless eyes of the woman staring intently at him. The light in the car's cabin flickered erratically, and in the darkness, all the windows were wild and elongated, yet never ending. Mr. Thomas trembled in terror. "WH, who are you?" But only the darkness answered him. And the distorted face from earlier was no longer behind him. The car was still speeding along the dark road, propelled by an invisible force that drove it on without Mr. Thomas's control. In panic over losing control, he screamed into the night, his voice seemingly swallowed by the thick darkness. He gasped for breath, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt, but the image of that woman's white eyes and sinister smile lingered in his mind. Mr. Thomas turned the steering wheel sharply, desperately trying to regain control of the vehicle, but it felt as though an unseen force was gripping his hands tightly, steering the whole truck. The road ahead became hazy, blurred like colors bleeding into each other, while the trees along the roadside turned into bizarre shadows, their trunks twisting, branches resembling skeletal hands reaching out as if to grasp the truck. With every turn of the tires, the pavement seemed to buckle and break apart, swaying dangerously. Mr. Thomas muttered in panic, hoping this was just a dream to reassure himself. But everything around him seemed to betray him. Every time he tried to control the car, the strange phenomenon grew increasingly fierce. Suddenly, from ahead, a figure unexpectedly appeared in the middle of the road, standing still and motionless. The headlights illuminated the distorted face of this person, causing Mr. Thomas to recoil in horror. He immediately slammed on the brakes, but as before, the brakes had no effect. His eyes widened in despair as he realized he couldn't stop. The car continued to speed toward that figure, Mr. Thomas's screams mingling with the shrill laughter echoing in the space. A terrible impact occurred, his entire body was thrown forward, but the seatbelt tugged him back. Even so, he still slammed his head against the steering wheel, feeling as if thousands of shards of glass shattered, the light before his eyes flickered and then plunged into complete darkness. Mr. Thomas gasped for breath, struggling to open his eyes, but his body felt weighed down by some pressure. The shrill laughter faded away, leaving behind a terrifying silence. He felt blood trickling down his forehead, flowing down both sides of his cheeks, but what chilled him to the bone even more was the icy cold spreading throughout the cabin. In the dim darkness, he struggled to raise his head and his eyes continued to meet a horrifying image, the woman with the distorted face standing right in front of the car. Her blank white eyes stared at him as if piercing through his soul, blood from the wounds on her face dripping down, each drop hitting the pavement and forming a dark puddle at her feet. Mr. Thomas tried to start the car to reverse, but the vehicle remained still, the woman made no move, just standing there motionless like a ghost. The fear in Mr. Thomas's heart reached its peak, and in that moment, he realized a terrifying truth: she was no longer a living person. "Where is my son?" the whispering voice echoed. But this time it wasn't from behind, but from the very woman in front of him. That voice echoed like a call from the grave, causing the space around Mr. Thomas to tremble. I don't know." Mr. Thomas stammered, his voice trembling into incoherence, but she did not stop, continuing to advance towards him step by step on the blood-stained ground. It felt as though thousands of knives pierced his skin, slicing through every vein, every cell in his body. Mr. Thomas tried to scream, but no sound could escape. The car suddenly shook violently, nearly throwing him from the driver's seat. The car door flung open, and in that moment, Mr. Thomas saw the woman rushing towards him, her distorted, slathered face mere inches from his. Suddenly, a blinding beam of headlights flashed before his eyes, forcing Mr. Thomas to shield his gaze, and the girl vanished instantly, as if melting into the air. Nevertheless, that cold breath clung to him fiercely like invisible hands coiling around his neck. Mr. Thomas could only hear the final whisper echoing in his mind like a curse from the underworld. "Where's my child? Give my child back." The headlights flashed from another truck speeding toward him from the opposite direction. In that moment, Mr. Thomas was pulled back into reality. He was still sitting in the cabin, his truck still parked in place, except the engine was running and the headlights were on. It was this eerie occurrence that made him realize something strange was enveloping the vehicle. Mr. Thomas shivered at the thought of what had just happened, a sense of unease rising within him. The horrific images, the strange noises in the dead of night, and the feeling that something soulless was present. Not wanting to take any more risks, he decided to head home, canceling his trip. Although he knew this might cause some trouble at work, the thought of finding out the origin of the truck became increasingly clear in his mind. Something was amiss, he needed to know exactly what was happening, especially when he connected it to the unusual call that Mr. David had made to him. The journey back seemed longer than usual, the truck still running smoothly. But Mr. Thomas could not shake off the chilling sensation. Upon arriving home, the sky was still dark. Immediately, he called Mr. David. "Hello, Mr. David, come over to my house right away." Mr. Thomas spoke briefly and then hung up. Mr. David, surprised, couldn't help but ask, "What's going on? Why such an urgent call?" Mr. Thomas lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and then recounted the entire story of what he encountered during the trip to Mr. David. After listening, Mr. David pondered for a moment before speaking. "Do you remember I called you at midnight to check on the situation?" "No." "Do you recall that when I drove back yesterday, I was all disheveled, and you asked me about it?" "Actually, I also encountered something strange yesterday, just like you. I even saw those horrific images after I got home." "Really? Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought it might just be some issue or a hallucination. I only mentioned it after you had gone home because it was difficult to explain over the phone. I never expected that you encountered it too today. So what issue are we facing now?" "The day before yesterday, I also had a nightmare right in this house." "Do you think it's due to this car?" "What does this car have to do with it?" "Just think about it, ever since we bought this car, both of us have been encountering strange omens and bad luck. It's not just a coincidence." Thomas pondered for a while and then finally seemed to agree. "So, this car has a problem then? No wonder I bought it so cheaply, and even when I negotiated down, that broker still sold it." "Do you still have the broker's number?" "Yes, I have it here. But if there's an issue with the car, it's not certain he will meet us again. Give me the number, I'll set up an appointment with him tomorrow. The car, like mine, is a new buyer." "Alright, let's do that." As soon as the sun rose, Thomas and David decided to contact the broker to sell the car. Fortunately, the broker had no suspicions at all. Both of them meticulously planned for this meeting, knowing full well that the information they were about to extract would not be easy to obtain. David pretended to be a car buyer and arranged to meet the broker at a location in a quiet little coffee shop tucked away in a narrow alley. When they arrived, Thomas and David noticed a man already sitting in the corner of the CAF. He was relatively short, around 40 years old. The man's face was quite calm, but his sharp eyes concealed many unpredictable things. Thomas entered without hesitation, walked straight to the table, and pulled out a chair to sit down. David followed closely behind, trying to keep calm despite feeling anxious inside. The broker looked at them. Upon seeing Thomas, he seemed surprised and a bit flustered. "Oh, it turns out to be an acquaintance. Hello, sir, how's the car running?" That seemingly innocuous question only made Thomas more annoyed. "What car are you selling me? Do you even know what happened to me?" Thomas shouted, his voice trembling with anger. The broker was taken aback by his intense reaction and quickly raised his hands in self-defense. David also tried to intervene with his friend. "Hey, calm down." The broker spoke in a panicked tone. Yes, let's take it easy and talk calmly. Why are you so worked up about the car?" Thomas sulkily sat down across from him, while David remained calmer. "The car is fine, runs quite well. However, there are some strange incidents that can't be explained. We want to ask you about the history of this car. Do you know anything?" The broker fell silent for a moment, his eyes showing a hint of panic, but quickly returned to normal. He placed his coffee cup down, looked straight at the two men across from him, and asked in return, "So what have you two encountered?" Thomas got straight to the point, recounting the strange phenomena they had both experienced. David also shared his own story. By this point, the broker no longer hid anything. "I only know that this car was bought from a person who didn't want to disclose their identity. He sold the car for a low price and only asked me not to ask too many questions about its past. But I heard in passing that the previous owner had a serious accident that resulted in a fatality. The accident seemed to be related to a girl." When David heard this, his heart raced like crazy. The images of the girl from that night flooded back into his mind, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Thomas cursed, "Damn this guy, why didn't you tell me? I did say so, how could I sell the car? I just earned a bit of commission, please understand. We shouldn't keep complaining anymore, it's clear now. Please give us the address of the previous owner. We'll take care of the rest." After saying this, the two took the address of the previous car owner from the broker and then left immediately. Before leaving, Thomas didn't forget to give this guy a glare. "Remember this, you little punk." Then, in the CAF, Thomas asked David, "What now?" David lit a cigarette, took a drag, thought for a moment, and then replied, "Now, who knows? We're dealing with some spiritual issues, we need to find a shaman. You take charge of finding one, and I'll go to the old place to see if I can gather any more information." "Alright, that works. See you at my house in the evening," Thomas agreed. "I am going to find the teacher right now. If possible, I will do it again tonight." After reaching an agreement, the two of them decided to take turns each day. David arrived at the location around noon, following the directions he had obtained, and found himself in front of a spacious two-story house. However, from the outside, it looked somewhat desolate. "Is there anyone here?" David called out as he stood at the gate. After a moment, a middle-aged woman appeared and replied, "Who are you looking for?" "Hello, ma'am. May I ask if this is Mr. Robbins' house?" "Yes, what do you want?" "I'm looking for Mr. Robin regarding a matter." The middle-aged woman sighed, stepped outside to open the gate, and let David in. However, as he stepped up the 3 steps, David froze when he saw a freshly set-up spirit table with incense smoke curling up. David asked, "May I ask, ma'am?" "Yes, you're here to find my husband, but it's too late. My husband died over 2 weeks ago." "He's dead, can you elaborate on that?" It was only in the late afternoon that David finally left, unable to hide his sense of disappointment. The previous owner of the car had died, and according to the wife, this person had died of a stroke while sleeping. However, David believed that it was not natural for the former owner to suddenly die of a stroke. Perhaps he had encountered a terrifying sight that left him unable to stand. David saw Thomas making a phone call. He picked up and said, "Hello, I'm listening, what's going on?" "It's a long story, just wait until I get back and we can talk." In the evening, when David returned to Thomas's house, he saw a lot of offerings, money, and paper items in the house. He also noticed a stranger sitting and talking with Thomas. When David arrived, Thomas called him in. "This is Master Luca whom I invited over." "Yes, I greet you, Master, I am David." The person Thomas referred to as Master Luca smiled at David. At that moment, David had the chance to observe Master Luca. He had the appearance of the elderly men seen in period films, with his hair tied up high and a white beard. His wrinkled face held bright, piercing eyes that seemed to see through the hearts of those before him. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Master Luca began to explain slowly. Regarding the harassment of a wronged soul or objects that directly caused death, specifically in this case, the car. I have explained this in detail to both of you. Now, there are two choices. One is that I will perform a ritual to exorcise and banish the vengeful spirit, ensuring it will no longer disturb the living world. The second option is more challenging. If you both have goodwill, you can help resolve the karma for the deceased, seek out the memories of the departed, and from there help them let go of their grievances, allowing them to be reborn as humans. At this point, Mr. Thomas did not need to think long and replied immediately. "Yes, I choose the first option, Master. Please help exorcise this entity, otherwise, it could cause me great harm." David, however, thought differently. "Master, I choose the second option." "David, how will you resolve the karma for the deceased? Did you not hear what the Master said? Fulfill the wishes of the departed." "But how do we know what their wishes are, or who they are? Both you and I have often heard that girl continuously calling for you. Perhaps she has just met your child. In any case, we must give it a try. She is just a victim of a traffic accident, she doesn't deserve to be beaten so mercilessly." Teacher Luca said, "Good. A person with a compassionate heart like you will surely encounter good fortune. All right, I will perform a ritual, part of it to dispel the accumulated malevolent energy, and part to give you some more time. But it won't be for long, you two must hurry." Mr. Thomas looked at his friend, who had a hint of hesitation in his eyes. Finally, he sighed, "All right then, I will listen to you." That evening, Teacher Luca conducted the ritual, and afterward, he took out two paper figures representing the victims, wrote the names of the two people on them, and placed them on the truck. He also wrapped red thread around the vehicle. Once everything was done, he said, "For now, I will keep the vengeful spirit of the young girl at bay, but it will only last until tomorrow night. At least during this time, nothing else will happen. You two can rest easy." "Yes, thank you, teacher." At a single-story house with a red tile roof located on the outskirts of the city, there was a man sitting in front of the house at that moment. His dazed gaze looked toward the horizon, where the sunset tinged the area with a crimson hue, signaling the end of a day. The man took a drag on his cigarette and exhaled a puff of white smoke. Beneath his feet lay numerous cigarette butts, enough to understand he had been sitting there for quite a while. Every so often, he glanced inside the house, toward a small corner where a child lay still and motionless on the bed, accompanied by several machines attached to the little one. From the kitchen, an elderly woman climbed up the stairs. Seeing her son lost in thought, she sighed and said, "Ngha, if you keep this up, you're really going to worry your mother. Cheer up, any pain will eventually pass. Moping around won't solve anything." The man named Ngha took his last drag of the cigarette, flicked the ashes away, and immediately pulled out a new one to light, briefly responding, "Yes, I know, Mom. Every time you say you know, but I don't see you change at all. You still have your child to think about. What should I do now?" The mother said, "My wife is dead, and my son has been in a coma for many days without waking up. I don't have the money for treatment in the hospital, so I have to bring him home. What else can I do? There's nothing left for me in this life." The mother sighed, feeling equally devastated. Previously, her son's family had been in an accident. Her daughter-in-law was dead, her grandson was in a coma, and her only son was consumed by sadness, abandoning his job to take care of his child day after day. All she could do was swallow her tears in silence. While the two mothers were conversing, two strange men entered the courtyard, carrying lamps and fruits. The elderly woman was surprised and stepped forward to ask, "Who are you looking for?" These two men were Mr. Thomas and Mr. David. After a whole day of searching, they finally arrived here. After all, they had obtained this address from information provided by the former owner's wife. However, without a phone number, the two men had to wander around endlessly to find it. Mr. Thomas spoke up, "Hello, we are looking for NGHA. What do you want with him? Are you John?" "Yes." "May I come in and talk for a bit?" Although not fully understanding, John and his mother still invited Mr. Thomas and Mr. David inside. As they stepped in, the two men noticed a table filled with smoke from incense, surrounded by many couplets, and there on the altar was a photo of a pretty woman with a radiant smile. Though this image was far different from before, it was not difficult for both men to recognize the woman. Both were even more startled to see a child, about 7 years old, lying in bed in the corner of the room with various medical equipment surrounding him. "This is my son. You haven't mentioned why you are looking for me." "Hello, young man, I am David and this is Mr. Thomas. We are here regarding this woman. My wife." Both John and his mother, who had just stepped out, were quite surprised by that statement. Mr. Thomas and Mr. David exchanged glances and sighed, then proceeded to recount everything to the mother and son, including the two choices that Mr. Luca had mentioned. "I came here," both John and his mother could not hold back their emotions. Thank you for always supporting the channel and welcoming its videos. Wishing you good health and remember to subscribe to the channel to reach 1,000 subscribers.